Hi, students. This week we are taking media relations into the digital sphere. So, we learned a lot about how media relations worked last week, and the three major things that I wanted you to consider were newsworthiness, the beat or the target market that you were going to be targeting with your story, and the timing. Now, the same elements still apply in the digital sphere when you're working in social space, but the timing is a little bit different, and the ways in which you generate exposure and generate excitement for your story are a little bit different. So we're going to recap with some social media fundamentals that we talked about last term. Then I'm going to introduce you to the PESO model. We'll speak directly about digital media relations, and then I'll give you some key tools and tips. And this week in class, we're going to be doing the same thing as last week, which will be workshopping press releases that were made specifically online and looking for the hook, the story, as well as sort of identifying some target markets that you might want to pitch this press release to. So first, let's talk about social media fundamentals. This is what I introduced to you last term, and it won't be brand new to you. But just as a recap, we have to remember that we're operating in digital in the social fields is generally very interactive. What this means is that communication is not one way, it's two way, and you should expect that if you're communicating in a social media sphere that your audiences are going to be able to communicate back to you, and that it's actually much more of an engagement than just a complete promotion of one message. Which means that you're moving from a monologue, which is one person talking, to a dialogue, which is at least two or more people talking together. What we now have is consumers who are more active and they're actually creating content and producing it, and there's a deeper engagement and an expectation that there's a level of engagement in social. This also means that relationships are formed between brands and their audiences, and that communication happens more in a side-to-side kind of cross way as opposed to sort of coming from the top and down. What this all means is that there are so many different opportunities and iterations for communication with your audience, whether that's one-to-one directly, let's say in a DM or private message, or it could be one-to-many, or it could be many-to-many, so other people actually talking to each other. So you have to factor in the fact that there are so many different ways of communicating across different channels. You have to consider that. And the thing to remember about planning a social campaign is that it's pretty much similar to planning a regular campaign. And so if you go back a few weeks and when I introduced to you to the 10 steps of campaign planning, the idea is that you have to set your aims and objectives, define your audience, gather your insights and understand the environment, figure out your budget, figure out the regulatory, policy, government, economic, social environment. And only after that do you actually start to create content. So the content actually happens quite further down the line. And then you manage the platforms, you measure and evaluate success, and then you create an ongoing knowledge and evaluation loop. So it's a very similar structure to a regular formulaic campaign plan. It's just like a regular PR campaign, except obviously there are different facets because you're working in different platforms at different times as well. So if you're writing for social, the other things to keep in mind is that obviously the language is going to be a little bit different than it would be in a more formal, traditional media relations sense. The KISS principle always applies here. Keep it simple, stupid. Don't overcomplicate the message. You want to make sure that you're writing for your audience and using the appropriate language and tone. You need to be brief. You've only got seconds, if that, to grab people's attention, but you also need to be thorough. So it's a lot harder actually in terms of making sure you get your point across because you have less time to do it. You also need to make sure that the golden rule still applies. This means that when you're pitching a news release, an e-news release, you still have to make sure that all of the relevant information is contained. This is the who, what, when, where, why. All of the basic information that people needs to be contained. But you also need to consider the platform. Is it a social platform? Is it a blog? Is it a website? What kind of social platform? What kind of audiences are on there? How much time do they spend and how do they use that platform? And then obviously the timing and the relevance is also going to be different in a social space because it's more in real time. And so you obviously have opportunities to not only launch your information, but to keep the conversation going over time. And you're not so bound by the editorial deadlines that you would have had in a traditional media relations situation. So, excuse me, those are the fundamentals. I want to introduce you now to something called the PESO model, PESO. What this stands for is paid media, earned media, shared media, and owned media. This is essentially the chart you want to use when you're starting to plan your online campaign. So paid media is obviously going to be more kind of on the advertising front, but now there is crossover with PR where you can pay for sponsored posts, you can pay influencers, for example, and those will sort of look a little bit more like PR than your traditional kind of display advertising. You also have earned media, which is traditional, the PR, the stuff that you get out of persuasion and having a strong pitch copy and newsworthiness in your copy. You've got shared media, which is going to be things that you are sharing on social and that gets shared on your behalf. And then finally, you've got owned media, which is actually the space that you own, which would be like your website and your blog. Excuse me. So let's look at this a little bit more in detail. How does it work? Well, paid media is going to be things like sponsored posts, advertorials, boosted posts. So you're paying Twitter or you're paying Facebook to get a little higher on the news feeds, on the algorithm. It can also be considered to be social media advertising, digital advertising, etc. So again, that's going to a bit more on the advertising side, but some of it, because of the way it's hidden into regular content, makes it look a bit more like PR. And this is where the gray area, and I can understand where you might be confused, but this would be the paid portion of the PESO. The owned portion, as I said, is the stuff that you actually own and house in your brand and your organization. This is going to be your website. It's also any content you create, like research and white papers, videos, blogs, newsletter, employee stories, and case studies. And these are used a lot to add credibility to your other messages in the earned and shared space. Earned is going to be things like media relations, influencer relations, where the influencers willingly work on behalf of the brand, not just because they're paid. Blogger relations, word of mouth, building links in the community. It's all about the work that you do to actually get people to want to work on your behalf, and they're not getting paid for it. And then shared is going to be your socials, your Twitter feeds, your Facebook, Instagram, TikToks, your influencer engagement, partnerships, charity links, and sponsorship. So this is where you're sharing the content and you're working in collaboration with other organizations, and they are sharing the content on your behalf. So it's quite an integrated model where you can see all of the different touch points. And when you're starting to plan your campaign, you want to look at all of these areas in separation to understand how you can reach the most audience the most effectively. So again, what you're looking at is, where are you getting the exposure? This could be, opportunities to see impressions, branded mentions, unique visitors, etc. So you look at each of your verticals, your areas, and you decide, how do we get exposure? But then also, how do we get engagement in this area? So how do we actually entice people to talk to us and to share content and to talk to us? And then how can we get some influence here? Where can we actually start to expand exponentially? And then what is the action that we actually want people to perform in these verticals? So this is a very detailed and complex formula, but it is used very, very widely when people are actually looking at all of the different channels that they're going to use social, because you can't just use one. It has to be an integrated campaign, and you've got to make sure that everything matches together with your messages. So using the PESO model to make sure you cover all of the different areas that you're supposed to be operating in, and then making sure that you're actually getting people to move from a simple exposure to your message to actually acting on it, whether that's buying your product, sharing the information, or writing back to you or whatever, voting for you, etc. That's where you kind of want to move people along the continuum. So that's the peso model. Now let's talk a little bit about how digital media relations actually starts to come together. So you learned last week about press releases, and you learned that they are a tool to entice journalists to pay attention to the news of the day. So you've got a story, you've got a good headline, you've got a lead, and that's where the news is, and you're trying to get their attention, you're trying to get them to actually pay attention and write about you or talk about you on air. Social media press releases work the same way. It's just that the audience is a little bit different. And because they're digital, the means of delivery is also a little bit different. It also gives you a lot more freedom and flexibility in terms of the types of information that you can provide. So, for example, you still need a very catchy headline and something that's going to grab a journalist's or a blogger's or an influencer's attention. But you need the main information has to be newsworthy and has to be something that is going to be worthy of writing or talking about. But you have the option of including a lot of multimedia content. This could be images, videos, music clips, anything else that kind of adds flavor to the story, as well as hyperlinks and any RSS feeds that you could have them linked to for constant updates. So again, it happens a little bit more in real time. It's not as static as a press release in print format would have been. Obviously, you want to include your socials and where they can find you and follow you. And in every case, a press release is going to have what's called a boilerplate. Now, this is an important term that you need to remember because your press releases that you're writing for your portfolio are going to need a boilerplate. A boilerplate is essentially one paragraph at the end of your press release that explains who your company is from a very high level. It can be your mission statement, your values, the number of employees you have, a brief history, nothing more than a paragraph, but what it does is it sort of tells the reader everything they need to know about your organization. And it always lives at the end of a press release, whether that's a traditional press release or a digital one. And then finally, you're not going to send a press release without sending your contact details. You need to give the journalists a way to reach you. So it's going to look something like this. This is essentially sort of a template, and you can see you've got the headline, you've got the core news facts, and sometimes that can be in a bullet point or narrative. Then you've got links to different pages that are relevant, RSS feeds, or if there's a delicious page you're using. Then you're going to have pre-approved quotes, and we'll talk about the quotes later, but you're going to have up to 2 quotes per contact, and those quotes are going to provide context and information that can be used in coverage. Then you want to provide 3 links that matter, and this is going to be to blog posts, white papers, background information, etc. Then your boilerplate statements, and then all of your information at the end about where this information can be seen or shared. Now, obviously, you've also got an opportunity to provide space for comments. You've got all kinds of multimedia on the left in terms of photos, MP3 files or podcast links, graphics, videos, etc. And this is going to be something that's going to help you get your SEO, which is the main point of this, which is you want to optimize your search engine discoverability. So you want to be able to load your press release with as much information as possible that's going to actually increase your ability to get better SEO. So that's a press release for the digital space. As I said, it follows a lot of the same format that a normal press release would, except it's more layered because it has more access to links and multimedia content, and it's also more live. So there's an opportunity for people to get updates and link and new information as it's available. Some tools and tips I want you to think about when it comes to digital media relations. First is that you still have to track and measure your progress. In fact, probably more so because you have the tools to do so. So the first is that you need to be using social media dashboards. And this is going to be something like TweetDeck or Hootsuite, where you are looking at your socials from a glance and you're starting to understand the big picture. Second is you want to be able to sort of track your influence, and a lot of brands will use something like Clout, and there's more of them out there as well, that track how much actual exposure you're getting and how much influence that gives you in the digital sphere. You want to make sure that you're tracking your statistics, and Google Analytics, Facebook Analytics, TweetReach, etc. They all give you lots and lots and lots of information about who is seeing your posts, when and where. But you also probably, depending on the size of your organization, would be utilizing some sort of media monitoring or reporting service like Cision, Metrica, Radian 6, where they will do the listening for you and tell you about the value of your social engagement. And obviously, Google Analytics is very powerful as well. So tracking and measuring is important, but you also need to remember there are some key tools that you should probably be using to make your posting better as well. The first, I go back to Hootsuite, which is a social media management platform, and it's really helpful for scheduling content. So again, if you're going to be doing posts on a regular basis every Wednesday afternoon, you post your blog or you try to tweet, 5 times a day at the same time every day to develop some consistency, or you want to make sure that you're getting key messages out there at the right time to align with other aspects of your campaign. Hootsuite can help you manage the timing on those. A site like Bitly is really helpful for shortening your links into something that doesn't use a lot of characters, helpful for Twitter, and it also allows for the analytics of link performance. So if you wanted to do A/B testing and use one link for one page and another link for another message, you could test those messages and test those links to see which one is more effective. Something like Feedly is also useful in terms of being a news aggregator. So what this does is it actually takes all of the news of the day from the major media outlets and puts it into one place. So if you were trying to follow your brand and follow the way that you were spoken about in the news online, you would use Feedly as a way of telling you every day where you were being mentioned and what the coverage was. And hashtagify.me is a hashtag search and discovery engine, which actually helps uncover the most impactful hashtags. So if you're thinking about creating a hashtag campaign, or you want to use certain hashtags, you want to sort of inject yourself into a discussion using hashtags, that's a good place to find the most effective ones that are most trending and most popular at that time. There are lots of ways to get better engagement, and there are some really useful tools to do so as well. So the first is that what you want to do is, you want to use informed content, and you want to share content that actually is useful to you, but also might be useful to your audiences. So this could be about industry trends or best practices, or, certain things that are entertaining, but, think about what your brand is and what kind of content you're sharing. Multimedia is always a powerful tool. You've got to focus on infographics, videos, and images wherever you can. You know this, you pay attention more when there's something to see or experience rather than something just to read. So you've always got to be thinking about how can I relay this message in a more multimedia format? It's always sometimes a good idea to jump into online conversations using relevant and trending hashtags. That again gets you higher up on people's dashboards. And it's always helpful to make sure that when you're attending an event or when you're part of something, that you're using the organization's handles and hashtags so that they know that you're there, and you're also building on the exposure and the audience that they have. And finally, don't be afraid to go behind the scenes and post some more personal stories about the company lunches, team outings, certain things that are happening around the organization, just to give the organization a bit more personality. This is something you could do on social that you couldn't necessarily do in a traditional media relations environment. So that gives you a real overview of how social and digital media relations works. I just want to talk about a couple of key takeaways from today. First is that digital media relations essentially follows the same principles as traditional media relations. You still have to understand what your objectives and goals are and who your key audience is, and what you have to develop your key messages. From there, you do your strategy, tactics, timing, and evaluation, and it all falls into place. Content actually is one of the last things you think about. You have to do the legwork beforehand on your research and planning to know what you're actually going to say. The second is that the PESO model is really, really useful for you to separate and compartmentalize the various aspects of your online engagement. And so when you look at your paid, your earned, your shared, and your owned columns, then you can plan accordingly for how you're going to message for those platforms and what kind of expectations you have of audiences in those platforms. So when you're planning an online campaign, use the PESO model to break down the platforms into the different areas so that you know that number one, you're not missing any areas, and number two, you're using them most effectively. The most important thing about online and social media relations is that it's multimedia, multi-channel, and it has to adapt for platforms and audiences. So you have to use the peso model to understand all of the different platforms and audiences, and then build your content accordingly. This is a much more layered approach, and it's going to really rely heavily on links and multimedia resources to really help bring your story to life. And then finally, this is a constantly evolving and ever-changing field, and the only way that you're going to stay on top of it is by constantly educating yourself. Make sure you're reading PR Week. Make sure you're reading, you're following influencers in the area who are working in digital media relations and social media. Make sure that you are constantly updating your skills, because frankly, even some of these things that I might have told you today are probably hopelessly out of date, and there's better tools even that exist that will allow you to track your progress, analyze your results, access your customers, engage with them more deeply, and the software is constantly changing, so you've got to stay up to date if you want to work in this field. That's it for digital public relations. As I said, this week we're going to be looking at e-news releases and doing the same thing we did last week. We're going to be identifying the hook, the story, and we're going to be thinking about potential media outlets in the online space that we might want to be targeting with these messages. And I'm going to be asking you to be using the peso model to actually break down your targets into those different categories. That's all for now. I'll see you in class.